was asked recently by a member of the Armoured Emu Brigade community in relation to some videos I did about serving in the First World War and Second World Wars, where saying that those who sign up did so for the duration of the war plus 12 months. Namely, what did that 12 months mean? In a nutshell, that 12 months was an administrative boilerplate created by military officials to mitigate the expectations of those going to sign up, basically saying that just because the war was over, you weren't going to be immediately sent home. The reason for this was a safeguard for the Australian military officials to basically try and navigate the logistical nightmare of trying to repatriate tens of thousands of Australians plus material back to Australia when every other country was doing exactly the same thing. Because at the time, Australia's own merchant fleet was relatively small compared to the other countries, and we were going to be relying very heavily on American and British ships to get everyone home. So then what were you doing then? Was that 12 months an all-expense-paid holiday? No, but there was opportunities for recreation and sightseeing, though you were there on the King's Shilling, so you were expected to be working. But not everyone had to stay the whole 12 months. If your unit had been deemed not necessary for the occupation duties or the post-war society, your unit would be repatriated back to Australia, along with anyone who was also deemed ready to be sent home early. And in the First and Second World Wars, there was a rudimentary point system that had been developed to determine who got sent home first. In the Second World War, it was far more established. But basically, it was how long you had served, how many medals and wounds you'd received, how many dependents you had waiting for you back home, and if you're going back to a job that was deemed vital for the post-war reconstruction. And if you met all those criteria, you'd be bumped higher up in the chain. Those of you who didn't have those criteria, maybe you joined towards the end of the war or you had nothing to go back to, what were you doing? Basically, occupation and garrison duties were the two main things that Australians were doing. Your garrison duty, garrisoning friendly territory that had been occupied by your opponent, and occupation duty of formerly enemy territory. But you're doing pretty much exactly the same thing. You were cataloging of enemy combatants and prisoners of war, repatriating of any combatants that weren't your own. You were dismantling the war apparatus you'd been participating in for the last 4 and 6 years, and assisting the locals in any form of policing or stabilization until a civilian authority could be sent out to resume control. On top of that, you were also undertaking training. So one thing that the Australian military understood very quickly was that bulk of their soldiers came from working class societies. They were mostly laborers. So what the military did was they introduced and created schools across the world, teaching pretty much anything and everything that a soldier would want to learn. They had schools for boiler making, carpentry, electrical work, farming techniques, agriculture, aquaculture. Is anything if you wanted to learn and they could find someone to teach it, the military would set up a school for it for you. And if that schooling had then been deemed vital to the war effort, on top of things like reading, writing, arithmetic, and things like that, and civics to get you back into civilian life, you will then be bumped higher up in the chain and get to go home early. What you would also do is volunteer for extra duties. So you could volunteer to be a part of the Graves Registry, which was repatriating and reburying all of our war dead. You'd work for the Australian War Records section in collecting and cataloguing any of the relics being collected from the battlefields to be sent back to Australia. But also you could volunteer for additional military duties. Things like the British Commonwealth Occupation Force of Japan in the Second World War, and the White Force, which was the Allied force assisting the democratic anti-communist forces during the Soviet Civil War. Now, it should be noted, though, that while that boilerplate was duration of war plus 12 months, not everyone was actually sent home within that first 12 months. And actually, there were several bits of anger from soldiers who were stationed on islands, specifically in the Pacific, who were still in those islands well after that 12-month period. And it should be noted, though, that for both conflicts, the last Australian soldiers returned home in the First World War were in 1921, and for the Second World War was 1947, which tells you all right now that the war ended well beyond those 12 months.